USS Burgle sliced through black water, a low, humming silhouette barely disturbing the glassy surface as her crew methodically carried out a routine mine-laying operation off the coast of French Indochina. The night smelled of salt and oil and the distant tang of engine exhaust. Sailors moved like shadows along the deck, voices kept to a whisper under orders that treated even the ordinary as something to be respected. In the control room, instruments ticked and screens glowed until a signal that did not belong to their charts and frequencies cut through the static. Powerful, deliberate, unmistakably military. Lieutenant Commander John Hyde felt the temperature shift in his chest, the way a captain does when a horizon changes. He left his post and raced to the periscope, fingers steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline, because the life of every man on board could hinge on what he could see through that narrow glass. Through the periscope, Hyde scanned the seam of sea and sky. For a long beat there was nothing but night, save for the faint trace of distant lights and the slow breathing of the ocean. Then a shape resolved itself out of the darkness, a hulking silhouette whose sheer bulk erased the stars behind it. It was the warship they had been hunting for months, a machine of steel and intent the size of a small city, its superstructure a forest of antennas and gun mounts. The Burgle lay in waters too shallow to dive and vanish. She was exposed. Hyde had only seconds to judge range, bearing, and the odds. He barked orders with the calm of someone well-practiced at making impossible choices, and, despite the depth, commanded the forward tubes be readied. 6 torpedoes were released in a nervous arc that cut through the oily water like black comets. 2 violent detonations bloomed against the night, and for an instant the sea itself seemed to burst into daylight, revealing a ship torn open and a column of fire licking at her decks. What Hyde and his crew saw next was the grotesque, surreal undoing of ordinary physics. The massive hull appeared to split, not into wreckage that sank, but into 2 living halves that turned as if animated by a single will and trained their broken noses back toward the Burgle. Panic is a quick thing on a submarine. Discipline is slower. Men gripped railings and instruments, voices dropped lower, and every crew member became a focused knot of muscle and training, waiting to see if steel and courage would be enough. Before the world exploded into open conflict between the United States and Japan, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already been engaged in an arms race of its own, quietly constructing vessels designed to dominate sea lanes and project power across vast oceans, in naval yards that smelled of hot metal and varnish. Engineers and shipwrights stretched treaty language to its limits and sometimes beyond, seeking every advantage they could squeeze out of displacement limits and armament restrictions. The Washington Naval Treaty had attempted to freeze naval competition by imposing caps and ratios, but human ingenuity and national ambition rarely respect ink and signatures for long. Out of that tension came the Myoko, the lead ship of a class that embodied both finesse and excess. A heavy cruiser that began life within imposed bounds and then, through refits and reinforcements, grew into something far more formidable. Myoko and her sisters represented a philosophy of naval warfare that favored concentrated firepower, long reach, and the ability to dictate engagements at range and at night, when torpedoes and surprise favored those willing to push the envelope. Over the years, the Myoko class changed. What began as a sleek, treaty-conforming cruiser was gradually transformed by additional armor plates, larger magazines, and heavier gun mounts until, by the mid-1930s, she displaced nearly 16,000 tons and cut a silhouette more like a small battleship than a cruiser. Her hull stretched to some 670 feet, and along her sides a thick belt of armor and an armored deck sought to catch and deflect the weight of enemy shells. But protection alone did not define her. It was what she could throw at an enemy that stamped her legacy. 10 8-inch main guns, each a thunderhead of forged steel and explosive potential, could fire broadsides that turned night into a rain of shrapnel and flame. Secondary batteries and dual-purpose mounts kept aircraft and smaller ships at bay, while her torpedo armament, the fearsome long-lance type, gave her the ability to launch salvos with a reach and speed that left little time for reaction. A catapult and float plane complemented her heavy ordnance, turning the horizon into a network of eyes and voices that could spot a convoy off the edge of the visible world. When Myoko finished refits, she boasted firepower and versatility that made her one of the most dangerous cruisers afloat, a status she would steadily justify when war arrived. When the Pacific erupted into the conflagration of World War II, Myoko did not sit idle. She led formations, screened larger capital ships, and took part in night actions and bombardments that were designed to dismantle opposing fleets and choke supply lines. In the early stages of Japan's southern expansion, she was a spearhead. At the invasion of the Philippines, her guns and torpedoes helped clear the way for landings. At the Coral Sea and other engagements, she provided the heavy punch and reconnaissance support that turned operations into successes. One of her most notorious moments came during the Battle of the Java Sea, where the Japanese sought to smash Allied attempts to hold the Dutch East Indies. In the chaos of that battle, Myoko's gunners acquired targets among the retreating Allied flotilla, and in a series of disciplined salvos, found the British destroyer HMS Encounter. The destroyer, nimble but outgunned at range, did not recover from the hits Myoko scored. She went down fast, a testament to the cruiser's lethal precision. After the engagement, the water was littered with wreckage and oil slicks, a field of victory and loss that marked the Japanese capture of a strategic region and the gateway to vital oil supplies. The psychological effect was as important as the material one. Allied captains now had to plan on Myoko's presence when plotting any operation in those waters, and the knowledge that one ship could so swiftly turn the tide made her a priority target. Years of fighting and small victories accumulated into strategy, intelligence, and resolve on both sides. The Allies studied the patterns of Japanese movement, refined carrier strike tactics, and improved their reconnaissance and signals work until the day came when American carrier task forces could bring overwhelming air power to bear. By late 1944, the balance had shifted. Industrial might and tactical evolution gave Task Force 38 the capacity to project waves of aircraft hundreds of miles, and do so with accuracy and intent. On one such day, operating in a theater where sea and sky had become a single battlefield, carrier-based bombers descended on the Japanese formation in coordinated strikes that lit the horizon with explosions and left smoke plumes rising like dark totems. Myoko, steaming with other cruisers and battleships and attempting to maintain formation and cohesion, found herself under a rain of bombs and torpedoes aimed at breaking the fleet's spine. A torpedo found her starboard side near the aft engine rooms, a catastrophic hit that flooded compartments, shut down turbine lines, and rendered her propulsion painfully ineffective. The ship that had once outrun or outgunned many of her foes now coughed smoke and burned, a wounded giant forced to make hard choices about whether to stand and fight or to disengage and attempt to live another day. Her crew moved with grim efficiency, closing bulkheads and fighting fires, patching piping enough to allow steering. Rather than wait for the next wave, Myoko limped away under her own damaged power toward the relative safety of friendly ports and repair yards, bound for Singapore and the promise of patchwork fixes before she would be fit for combat again. Retreat did not mean surrender. It meant buying time. In dockyards and repair berths, she would receive jury-rigged repairs and replacements that might restore enough speed to rejoin the fleet, or at least enough to survive future storms of ordnance. Yet each scar carried a lesson for the Allied commanders. The Myoko could be hurt, and with enough coordinated air power and intelligence, she could be neutralized. The psychological edge that Myoko had once given the Imperial Navy was incrementally eroded by the tempo and reach of Allied operations. For Hyde and the men of the Burgle, who watched the line of fire ebb and the burning ship vanish into a smoky horizon, the encounter was a microcosm of the larger war. Individual bravery and brutal invention collided with industrial-scale tactics and ever-shifting advantage. In the cramped, humming guts of the submarine, men exchanged no grand pronouncements, only the quiet knowledge that they had witnessed something monumental, a leviathan of steel maimed and moving. A reminder that in naval warfare, victory often belongs to those who can see further, strike faster, and adapt quicker than their enemies. USS Burgle sliced through black water, a slim, purposeful shadow under a dome of stars, while her crew moved like practiced ghosts, ratcheting through the familiar choreography of mine-laying, lines checked, charges set, the hush of men who know the ocean will take their work and hide it. The night tasted of salt and oil and the metallic tang of diesel. The sea breathed slow and even, until a voice in the radio room cut through with something that did not belong to routine. A signal, hard and military, the kind that makes trained ears go still. Lieutenant Commander John M. Hyde felt that small, precise climb of awareness captains learn to trust and left his station in a sprint, palms flat and steady as he sealed the periscope and raised it into the black. Through the periscope he watched the horizon like a man trying to read a face in bad light. For a long time there was nothing but scatter and the soft glow of distant navigation lights. Then steel resolved out of shadow, a silhouette so large it swallowed stars. It was the shape they had been hunting for months, a heavy cruiser with a forest of superstructure and a wake that marked her as a prowler of deep interests. The Burgle floated in waters too shallow to vanish beneath the waves, exposed and vulnerable. Yet Hyde's training and hunger for a decisive action outweighed caution. He barked a chain of orders, and despite the depth called for the forward tubes to be readied. 6 torpedoes slid into the sea, black comets cutting the surface and vanishing into the night. 2 explosions roared up, turning water into a temporary noon. Flames licked the victim, and then the impossible. The hull seemed to tear, and the mass split into 2 separate ends that, as if ruled by a cruel intelligence, pivoted and pointed back at Burgle. Cold, practical discipline moved through the boat as men snapped to damaged control stations and braced for the reply. Years before the war had become a global furnace, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been building toward dominance with a quiet, relentless efficiency. Treaties and tonnage limits were maps to be read and then tested, and shipwrights and admirals bent designs and doctrine to find advantage. Out of that push came the Myoko class, cruisers that began as treaty-compliant vessels and then, through refits and additions, swelled into something far heavier and more dangerous. Myoko in particular accumulated armor and guns until she wore the silhouette of a small battleship. Her 10 8-inch guns, long-range torpedo armament, and reconnaissance float planes made her a weapon built to dictate terms at sea and haunt supply lines by night. The presence of a ship like Myoko in a theater changed plans and sleep patterns. Commanders recalculated risks, and skippers learned to assume the cruiser's shadow wherever they sailed. USS Burgle was part of a newer generation of naval predators, Balao-class, submarines that combined sturdier hulls with extra range and a battery of 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, backed by Bofors and Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns to fend off patrol planes. Commissioned in mid-1944 and placed under Hyde's command, Burgle and her crew became masters of radar trickery and night stalking. They learned the art of approaching in silence, of using the dark as a cloak while their instruments painted the sea in pings and blips invisible to human eyes. On patrols through the South China Sea, they struck with precision. The 4,182-ton tanker Shinsumaru went to the bottom first, followed soon after by the 10,728-ton Nippomaru, struck in a midnight thunder of 4 torpedo hits that sent her down before dawn. The boat returned from those early patrols with a rising reputation and a crew that had tasted both victory and the dry, cautious pride that keeps men alive in a submarine. On December 5, 1944, Burgle slipped away again, this time to sow mines around reefs off French Indochina. For days the mission was a study in tedium and maintenance, but on the evening of December 13th, an unfamiliar high-powered transmission cracked over the receiver and set the men to a new kind of alert. It was the kind of signal that says something big is moving close. Hyde judged the opportunity worth the risk and closed the distance, engines whining like a thing about to be dared. The boat's hum grew into a vibration so palpable it threatened to sing through hull and bone, and Hyde ordered speed cut to 18 knots to mask mechanical noises and lower the chance of detection. 3 hours of patient stalking passed before the radar painted a target 26,000 yards ahead, and when Hyde lifted the periscope, the target's profile, massive, flanked by lithe escorts, told him what his instruments could not: a heavy cruiser with company. The water was too shallow for escape below. Burgle's aft tubes were fouled by her own mines, and only the bow tubes were ready. It was a perilous geometry, an uneven fight, but the promise of removing a leviathan from the sea was a call a captain like Hyde could not ignore. At 20:37, Burgle fired. 6 torpedoes left the tubes and cut into night. 2 found purchase, and a convulsion of flame and smoke answered, the target rupturing aft of her bridge and 2 burning halves drifting apart until they were 1,000 yards wide. a horrific, incandescent memorial to violence and luck. For a breath, the submarine's crew believed the moment belonged to them. Myoko ended, the escort passive, the trophy almost in hand. They powered toward the wounded giant to finish the job, engines humming a grim work song, thinking of headlines and pensions, of a war turned a notch toward home. Then the sea flipped the script. From the direction of the broken cruiser, 2 torpedoes screamed out, not from Burgle, but seemingly birthed from the dying hulls themselves. One found Burgle's starboard side and tore through the torpedo loading hatch, ripping a 5-foot gape into the pressure hull. The sound of impact was a new language. Metal screamed, bulkheads groaned, water shoved into compartments with the force of a punch. Lights stuttered, bunks and gear became projectiles. Men trained for damage control moved like a single frantic organism, slamming hatches, isolating flooded spaces and fighting the immediate need to keep the boat buoyant and breathable. Hyde's calm turned sharp as he ordered pumps and counterflooding, felt the weight of every man's life hang on valves and welds, and understood in a dozen precise calculations what had happened. The sea had delivered a surprise strike from a source entirely unanticipated, and survival had just become the only objective. Those minutes stretched long, and the small ship became a theater of motion and noise. Hoses rattled, rivets creaked. Officers shouted concise commands and then translated them into hands-on work. Crews who had spent months learning the quiet routines of a submarine now worked in a storm of chaos. One man cut his hand on twisted metal, another lay stunned as a bulkhead bowed inward, and a third counted breathers while the sonar kept whispering possible threats. Outside, the night remained indifferent, the broken silhouettes on the horizon reduced to smoking wounds. But inside Burgle, the world narrowed to the size of pumps, patches, and the stubborn ingenuity of sailors. Hyde kept his voice low and exact. Every order was practice and prayer at once. Secure that hatch, start auxiliary pumps, jettison weight where possible, set ballast to keep the bow up. And in those orders, he threaded the knowledge that many submarines had been lost to slow floods or to the small cascade of poor choices that follow sudden damage. Gradually, by the virtue of training and a kind of grim luck, Burgle stabilized enough to breathe and think. Men worked in hot, seawater-scented pockets to patch the 5-foot hole, to shore bulkheads with anything heavy enough to hold the pressure for a few more heartbeats. When pumps finally gained the upper hand and sirens fell to urgent but less panicked tones, the cramped crew realized they had been granted a small reprieve. The boat still floated, lives were still accounted for, and there would be time to plan. The hard options: tow, limp back to port, scuttle in deep water if necessary. The encounter had been a brutal lesson in how quickly hunter and hunted roles can flip in naval warfare, and in how fragile metal and human determination are under the indifferent calculus of the sea. For Hyde and his men, the night left a residue of awe and a jagged sense of being cheated by luck, victory snatched away, survival earned at cost, and the knowledge that when dawn came, they would have to become once more a thinking, moving piece of the larger war. Repair, report, and prepare for whatever the ocean would throw at them next. The torpedoes that struck Myoko's port oil tanks produced a cataclysmic fireball that lit the night, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment convinced everyone aboard Burgle that the cruiser had been rent clean in two. In reality, the aft deck and superstructure aft of the bridge were blown away and sank, but the ship's propulsion, power rooms, and many vital systems stubbornly remained operational. Severe damage, yes, but not the death stroke the explosion had seemed to promise. Even worse for Hyde and his crew was that Ushio, the escort that had shadowed the cruiser, lay deceptively still, her silhouette unreadable against the smoke and glare as her crew assessed the burning hull and played the long game. The Japanese sailors were not fools. They knew an attacker might return to finish the job, and with a damaged prize to bait the trap, they chose patience over panic, feigning helplessness while setting themselves to spring an ambush once the Americans came. Back in for the coup de grâce. Hyde's quick decision to close and press the attack briefly turned the hunters into prey. The order to retire was given in a voice that tried for calm and missed by a degree. Burgle's engines coughed and then thundered as the damaged submarine forced itself away at flank speed. every man feeling the boat lurch under them and the smell of hydraulic grease and hot metal flood the control room. Ushio's guns began to staccato the night behind them, and 2 torpedoes sheared white trails across the sea toward the retreating hull. The first missed by mere yards, spraying molten water and foam. The second's wake kissed Burgle's side before vanishing into blackness, a near miss that left salt and adrenaline on every face. Refusing to yield, Ushio swung a searchlight like a blade and finally cracked the dark to reveal Burgle's damaged profile. Another torpedo loosed itself and screamed closer still. But fortune, call it training, call it luck, kept the warhead from finding purchase, and it sped harmlessly past. Inside the boat, men moved with the practiced violence of crews trained to turn terror into procedure. Valves slammed, hatches were dogged, mattresses and wreckage were wedged into ruptures to slow the inrush of sea, and crewmen with belt knives and wire-fashioned shoring that should not have worked, but did enough to keep the deck from vanishing beneath them. Ushio broke off the chase and remained with Myoko, its crew choosing to guard a crippled ally rather than pursue prey, and by nightfall the 2 sides counted their wounds. America's submarine had escaped, but only by inches, while Japan's cruiser, though afloat, had been grievously mauled and had lost the ability to steer under her own power. Each ship limped toward the only hope left to it, Burgle toward the long, hazardous run home, and Myoko toward whatever yards and tugs could make her seaworthy again. For Burgle, that run was a 2,000 nautical mile stretch back to Exmouth Gulf, Australia, a route that would thread through waters where Japanese patrols were active, and where any day could bring aircraft with bombs or surface combatants, with orders to sink any enemy at sight. The night after the ambush was a study in improvised surgery. Electrical fires crackled and popped in dark compartments. The boat's lights flickered under strain, and seawater sluiced through the 5-foot breach in the pressure hull and slid over bunks and radios. With no proper patching gear, they stuffed anything that would fill a hole. Rolled mattresses, tack-welded timber, torn canvas, and then used decking planks, metal braces, and sheer human weight to shore the buckling steel. It was ugly, loud work. Curses and terse directions braided with the hiss of pumps and the thump of emergency compressors as men worked in ankle-deep salt water to buy hours and then days. By dawn, Burgle still floated, but diving was impossible. The damage to the pressure hull and to the propulsion systems made submergence a likely death sentence, so Hyde faced the appalling choice to surface run in daylight toward home. The decision shifted reality from one set of dangers to another. Instead of relying on depth and stealth, they would be exposed to the sky, to patrol planes, and to the prowling eyes of destroyers. Every cloud could hide a Kawanishi H6K or a B5N. Every horizon could resolve into a wake bounding toward them. The day became a slow, taut watch. Gun crews kept station at the Beauforts and Oerlikons, eyes raw from scan and squint, fingers poised on triggers, while lookouts traced the air with the kind of nervous focus that makes even seasoned sailors feel younger and more afraid. For hours, the sea offered no threats, and a brittle hope grew among the men, until just past noon a silhouette rose on the far edge of the horizon, a Kawanishi H6K casting a slow, deliberate shadow as it circled to take bearings. Hyde cut a hard, oblique course toward the lee of cloud and coast, a maneuver that tried to cheat the bomber's eyes and coax it to move on. The aircraft drifted, considering, then banked away and melted into clouds, leaving every man aboard with a breath they did not know they had been holding. That narrow pass only underscored how little margin they had left, and Hyde knew instinctively, and his men felt it in their bones, that they could not rely on luck for the remainder of the voyage. Opportunity and desperation converged into a single, risky plan. Rather than cross open ocean where carriers and patrols hunted in lines and patterns, Burgle would hug the Japanese-held coastline of Borneo, moving close to reefs and inlets, hoping that proximity to shore might lend the sub a false identity as a local coastal vessel. The gamble required nerves and seamanship. Too close to shore and a wave or a misread chart could strip them onto reefs. Too far out and patrols would pick them off. Still, with the pressure hull patched by hand and pumps throbbing, Hyde set a course that would lean on shadows and geography, and the crew, exhausted but grimly determined, adjusted sails of survival to the new strategy, each man aware that the next hours would decide whether improvisation and courage could outweigh metal, sea, and the long reach of the enemy. The crew's faces tightened into lines of disbelief and anger as Hyde laid out the plan. To run a wounded submarine along enemy-held coast in broad daylight while unable to submerge sounded like a sentence to most of them. Yet there was an unspoken contract between captain and crew, and they accepted the gamble because they trusted the man who had kept them alive this far. Burgle crept low and slow, engines muffled, hull hugging the shoals as charts and depth soundings guided them past hidden reefs and mangrove mouths. The radio room kept radio silence, and the flares and signal lights stayed dark, while lookouts strained at the waterline and the men below listened for the far-off thump of patrol launches. For hours nothing came. No searchlights flashed from shore batteries, no romper of small arms fire, no clatter of boarding boats. And with each coastal mile behind them, a brittle hope grew that Hyde's calculation had been right. That night, safety felt close enough to breath on. Hyde allowed himself the curt dispatch back to base that officers send when the facts are raw and the morale thin, a line that would go down in the log as a terse, almost wry claim of success. Busted Burgles first. It was a small triumph to tuck away against the exhaustion and the aches of the men who had spent the last 2 days fighting pumps and patching, steel with their hands, but the sea had not. Finished with Myoko. The crippled cruiser crawled toward Singapore at a crippled 6 knots. Her afterdeck a ragged ruin and power lines coughing under the strain. Ushio lashed herself to the larger hull more out of duty than capacity, for one of her engines had been crippled in earlier fighting and she did not have the power to tow so much as an oil drum, let alone a heavy cruiser. The 2 ships, like wounded beasts, tried to steer with what was left of their steering gear and hope for tugs or calmer weather. By December 15th, the fires were beaten down and naval authorities managed to send 2 subchasers and a pair of minesweepers to shepherd the wreck towards safety, a naval procession of the wounded that offered a thin thread of optimism. The respite was short. Weather turned malignant, and within days a typhoon coalesced over the South China Sea, seas rising into mountain faces and winds battering everything afloat. By December 18th, the storm was a roar that stripped equipment from decks and drove waves that smashed and flexed the already fractured hull until whole sections of stern simply sheared away and fell into the hungry sea. In those days, the ocean was both judge and executioner. Myoko was left to list and groan while the rescue flotilla anchored and rode out the storm, powerless to make meaningful repairs in the open water. The same storm that unmade Myoko became Burgle's cloak. After clearing the lee of Borneo, the Americans rendezvoused with USS Angler, which carried the Grim. Orders from higher command to scuttle Burgle and evacuate. Her crew, the damage to the pressure, hull and the strain on life support made the boat, on paper, a liability that risked men's lives for salvageable metal. Hyde refused the simple calculus of abandonment and instead placed his faith in seamanship and weather. The low clouds and sheets of rain could hide a silhouette as well as sonar could not, and he believed the patched submarine could ride the storm to port if they made the right choices. 54 sailors were transferred to Angler, some weeping, some silent, most simply numb, while 29 volunteers, engineers and men who knew pumps and joints and shoring, stayed aboard Burgle with Hyde. It was a choice that sealed their fate if discovery came. Hyde ordered Angler to dive and carry the rescued men to safety, while Burgle, lighter but still dangerously wounded, slipped into the darkness alone. Night after night they threaded narrow passages, timing runs through the crests of the Karamata and Lombok Straits, and using the storm's acoustics and rain to muffle their engines. Every creak of a bulkhead was a signal, and every shadow might be a prowler. Near Bowen Island the gamble nearly failed. Voices carried over the water as a Japanese patrol sailboat came within yards, deck talk and the scrape of planks audible like a microphone to a man on watch. No tool was dropped. No cough betrayed them, and time stretched until the enemy drifted away. When dawn finally broke on December 20th and Burgle slid into Exmouth Gulf, she was a battered thing, patched with mattresses and timber, pumps whining, but afloat. The men who climbed from her hatches were tired, some unshaven, some limping from injuries, but alive. Proof that audacity, a storm's mercy, and a captain's stubbornness could, for a moment at least, outrun the sea's cruelty and the war's appetite for iron. Commander Hyde was awarded the Navy Cross and his crew hailed as heroes, USS Burgle becoming a whispered legend in the Pacific long after the engines fell silent and the men scattered to new stations. Myoko, dragged back to port and reduced to a stationary gun platform, haunted planning rooms and mess decks alike as an emblem of a ship that had once struck fear into convoys and now sat maimed by storm and torpedo fire. It took 10 days and the help of 8 escort vessels for Myoko to inch through waves that seemed intent on tearing her apart. Each mile a battle against tides and wind that bent the crippled hull until the stern finally tore away behind turret number 5. She limped into Singapore on Christmas Day, December 25, 1944. Not to cheers, but to the stern, duty-bound silence of a Navy that measured courage and service rather than spectacle. The damage was permanent. The aft section was severed. The exposed bulkhead hastily patched and sealed, and the cruiser was stripped of meaningful propulsion and steering, no longer a roving predator, but a static sentinel whose guns were pressed into harbor defense. Even so, the presence of that hulking wreck kept teeth clenched in Allied officers' planning rooms, and by mid-1945, the Royal Navy resolved to finish what Burgle had begun by neutralizing the remaining heavy cruisers in Singapore. Myoko among them and her sister Takao moored nearby. The plan was audacious. 2 X-class midget submarines to be towed into position, then slip through minefields, patrols, and anti-submarine screens to infiltrate the harbor and place explosive charges beneath the enemy hulls. Codenamed Operation Struggle and launched on July 30, 1945. The mission demanded patience and nerves of a particular kind. After being towed to a staging point at Labuan, the tiny subs began an 11-hour crawl across 40 miles of water thick with danger, threading between mines and watchful craft until, at one heart-stopping moment, XC-3 found herself under the very weight of a contact mine after a crash dive to evade a passing tanker and escort. The crew held their breath and then, by a blend of skill and luck, eased clear without detonation and pressed on. When the midgets finally reached the anchorage, Takao loomed like a fortress above them, and Lieutenant Ian Fraser worked his craft into position beneath the great cruiser only to find tides and grounding, leaving almost no room for maneuver. The mission fell to the divers, men whose work demanded both the calm of surgeons and the courage of soldiers. And James McInnes, squeezing into a space so tight he had to strip parts of his breathing gear and compress himself into the ship's belly, moved like a ghost under steel and oil, feeling the hulls groan and the tug of tides as he wound limpet charges into place with fingers that would not tremble. The pairs of midget crews timed breaths, currents, and charges with the precision born of long rehearsal and cold imagination. Plant the explosives, set timers, and then vanish into dark water and hope the sea and the machine held their secrets long enough. When the charges went, the harbor answered with shock waves and the dull, pregnant sound of metal surrendering to fire. Takao and Myoko, already wounded by storm and time, took further punishment that rendered them unfit for fleet action, and gave the Allies a final measure of closure on a threat that had once prowled the Pacific with impunity. The raids were surgical and costly in concentration and nerve rather than in massed tonnage, a reminder that sometimes small, intelligent strikes can achieve what fleets and convoys cannot, and the men who slipped under enemy keels returned with grime in their lungs and the quiet weight of having bent history by inches and explosives.